Enemy phase is dead. Whoa, the title of the video maybe, or it's a thumbnail, whichever I decide to choose. You know why it's dead? Because there are way too many player phase oriented tools that just punishes enemy phase strats. To put it into perspective, here are some enemy phase skills that we have. You know, godlike reflexes, miracle, damage reduction through maybe the B slot or drives, scowl, hardy fighter, ruse technically because it could shut off bridal catria and stuff in aether raids, canto control, a pretty sizable chunk of stuff. And on the other side, we have player phase skills such as piercing specials, B slot, support, rally spectrum, bride Catria, Winter Cordelia, Guidance, Crom 1, Crom 2, Crom 3, this lady I still refuse to pronounce her name, Sanaki, Gulvig, Kvassir, Hardy Bearing, Player Phase Damage Reduction Skills, Flared Sparrow, Occultist Strike, Assassin Strike, Legendary Hinoka, Wind Clawed, AoEs, True Damage, Fire Sweep Skills and Effects, Dagger 1, Dagger 2, Frayer, Feuds, Fatal Smoke, Miasma, so on and so forth. That's a lot of goddamn stuff, and I'm pretty sure most of us, including myself, doesn't know what half of these things do, which is okay because at this point with the amount of text in this game, I wouldn't really blame anybody. And maybe you're sitting there thinking that probably wasn't fair because you only listed a few enemy phase oriented skills and you listed a bunch of player phase skills. Why don't you list some more enemy phase skills? And to that I say, no, I'm not really going to do that. And look, I'm sure there are plenty of other enemy phase skills and plenty of other player phase skills, but I can tell you just writing this down on my notes, I was able to list down maybe 5 things about enemy phase skills and like 20 plus things when it came to player phase skills and some random assortment of units that just makes enemy phasing even more difficult without the need to consult anything. And does that make my point better? Not really. Anyway, you do also have Vantage, and it's technically an option for enemy phase stuff, but it's also extremely easy to check because not only do you have Hardy Bearing, which just completely shuts it off outright, you also have units that inflict flash effects, you have slow units that get affected by sweep effects, and assuming you have to get set up through a foe, there's a reason why a lot of people run units like Bernadette and Lysithea. It's because otherwise they are risking way too much. Was there a point to this whole thing? Yeah, some of the best tanks even to this day struggle despite how much they have. Do you remember when Brave Dimitri was like the best tank ever? Even though before he was like a really mediocre tank, I still ran him as like melee specialist stuff when that was a cool thing. And then he became really good. And then he became really bad because we're constantly getting ways to shut off enemy phase strategies. For a good while, Lucia was also one of the better enemy phase units that we had in the game. But once they started dropping stuff like physical no follow, magical no follow, tempo 4, and a lot of other skills and support that just gets through damage reduction without the reliance of a special, that's when it just became even more overkill. But honestly, if I had to pinpoint a time where this issue really started exasperating, I think it probably started with Bride Catria because turns out giving everybody Brave makes them really, really strong. And because everybody had Brave, it meant enemy phase had to compensate in some capacity. And that's when we got Hardy Fighter, like maybe a few months down the line with Volk and a lot of the other characters. That was not a very balanced B slot, I'll tell you that much, but nukes are just at a point where they're way too far ahead, and tanking is as good as dead in my opinion. I'm also one of the few crazy people who is suggesting stuff like Flame Mordecai player phase Gale Force strategies, because in my opinion, if you can afford to enter a player phase strat, then you probably should. Of course, that's not every archetype, but I'm wondering when we're going to enter that happy medium again, where a lot of other units besides specific archetypes, aka melee armors who have Hardy Fighter, are going to be able to enemy phase with a decent amount of prowess. Now, I will also say, I'm not a game dev, and I'm probably the last person they probably want to put on the job, although maybe they already put the last people on the job. Either way, what can we constitute as striking a proper balance? Obviously, we don't want fully unbeatable tanks, but I'm wondering when it gets to a point where the nukes just have it way too good, because enemy phase is an important strategy of the game. It's what makes the combat work, in my opinion. If you just had player phase only strategies, then I mean, to be honest, I don't think it would be very interesting, but we're kind of hitting that climax where a lot of units just will not be able to enemy phase. Everything has access to shredding at this point, so even through stuff like passive DR, it's not even that consistent. Of course, they could always just introduce another solution to it, because that's the current IS strategy. They introduce the poison, they wait till everybody's infected, the general populace decreases dramatically because they probably all died from the poison, and then they drop a hard counter or something very half-hearted, and it probably doesn't really do a lot at the end of the day. You know, it's probably why we don't get a lot of new players, and also the giant walls of text that also don't mean a lot for the unit, surprisingly, doesn't help either. I also noticed that it's just way easier to sell solutions to nukes. Whatever might negatively affect a nuke probably won't be as long-term comparatively to a tank, which is going to hurt them way more in the long run. But you know what the great thing about all this is? They already introduced all the effects necessary to remedy a lot of the nuking issues, but they either exist on PRFs or PRF skills, so it's not readily available to most units. This includes, but not limited to, Scowl, Tempo, Piercing effects, and Shred, as well as Brave damage reduction. We do also have Dima on Legendary Corrin's remix, but I'll get into those in a bit. The main thing I'm really just trying to get at is that I believe a tank needs to be able to stop doubles, stop specials or mitigate them, and prevent nukes from freely going in to succeed as a tank at this time. If you don't have all three of these, I think it's going to be an uphill battle for a lot of units. And you're probably thinking, who has the ability to? It's Winter Byleth. Granted, his follow-up prevention is through the B slot, but even if they double, they can't really freely go in as much because he has Piercing on special, he has a bunch of Scowl effects, and a bunch of damage reduction. The dude is mega jacked. Now, I'm not saying we need Winter Byleths for everybody, because that would probably be extremely toxic, and then that would change the battle from nukes are too strong to tanks are too strong, but I do think there are notable effects that they can easily implement through several inheritable skills in the future that at least to function at a much higher level than the whatever level you could consider them at right now. For starters, stopping doubles more often. This is where I want to go more into Demon's speed effect. He has an additional conditional. That sounded pretty funny, actually. Anyway, he has an effect that makes it so you have to have more than 5 speed to naturally double him. You can't use guaranteed follow-ups. You can't do anything of the sort to double him unless it's Brave or you just have way higher speed than he does. I think if they made that an inheritable effect for a lot of units, that could easily sway the tides for a lot of tanks that heavily rely on speed tanking, especially if they're only able to eat one hit before taking full damage on another single hit. One of the other important things too is just stopping specials or mitigating them, something like Veil or Lucia for example. Again, I don't think we need complete carbon copies of a lot of these units, but I also think if they put a harder cap on offensive special procs, it makes it so your tanks have a much better chance at survival, whereas right now they could easily go in with pre-charged specials or even AoEs, which just completely goes through stuff like Veil. And I will say, at the very least, they have been printing a bit more of AoE damage reduction. AoEs are just insanely imbalanced. And lastly, I think the one point I'm definitely leaning into the most is making it so nukes can't freely go in even if they can't kill. I think having the ability to counter back or have effects that make it so you would be risking so much by initiating combat and having them survive would make it so players would have to rethink their strategy before throwing nukes willy-nilly at pretty much anything that's in their way. For example, we have stuff such as Nightmare from Formotus, and I'm not saying everybody needs Nightmare or whatever the case may be, but I think if there were less incentives to just throwing stuff at the wall, then it would also add to your defensive capabilities. Granted, there are only so many effects in the game, I could hardly imagine what they could really do that would make it so widespread for tanks. They could also just allow units to counter back, even if it's just charging up their specials. This is one of the reasons why I absolutely adore the Distant Counter Melee Seal, because it gives armor such a massive buff for Aegis proccing and Sacred Cowl looping. It is such an incredible buff for them, but I still feel like there are more that these tanks can do that doesn't just heavily rely on defensive specials. Maybe they could get more offensive specials such as Armored Blaze, Beacon, Flow, but also doesn't come at the cost of your defensive prowess, so that way you could still act as a significant tank and deal damage at the same time. I think tanks need to have the ability to counter back and hit really hard, and maybe asking for any of these is a massive tall order or an insane ask, considering that most of these effects are very difficult to outsource without risking many other important matchups, on top of the fact that a lot of these effects have very easy outsourceable counters. You know, Fatal Smoke 4 for Maria's and Ymir's, or anything that relies on Miracle that isn't based on your special. You have Blue Feud for Veil. Rally Spectrum completely shuts off Drive Scowl, so on and so forth. There are already way too many nuking tools at the moment, to the point where I still think enemy phase units need a bit more of a buff, and they could easily do it. Armors could just get Hardy Fighter 4 and it has the negating Fang 2 effect where it procs twice against brave attacks. That way there's still a trade-off between dealing damage and surviving, and there are still plenty of counters against that too, whether that's running a Desperation set or AoE. There's enough trade-off there to where I still think it's a considerable upgrade. Ranged armors also need something tangible because, in my opinion, Weaving Fighter doesn't really cut it outside of Miracle strats, but at least it's something they can take advantage of. Melee Flyers, on the other hand, are probably fine because a lot of the time they don't have to fight ranged threats and can just act as guidance beacons and run Gambit and Guard Bearing 4 for frontline purposes. Even though no quarter and a bunch of shred is easily accessible, I don't think they're doing the worst per se, but they do have that one dedicated niche. Unlike melee infantry, who really don't have anything discernible outside of being able to use Canto Control, and I'm hopeful that maybe they'll get some more utility in the future because armors have saves and flyers have guidance, guard bearing, gambit, frontline stuff. Infantry don't really have much, even though ranged infantry are still considered some of the best nukes in the game as is. It would be really nice for the ones that can't really player phase to have some more of a discernible niche. And cavalry should probably stick to player phase strategies if they can. You're not going to tell me that some of the best enemy phase cav options wouldn't benefit if they were in literally any other archetype. I'm just saying. And what was the point of all this? Probably me ranting about unnecessary stuff again. But look, they can make enemy phase work again, but it's hard to say if they're gonna make it last long enough before it just completely gets curb stomped again. I still blame Bride Catria for all of it.